the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, they now have about $60 trillion who have signed up to a more responsible way of analyzing some of these factors. That's about 1,500 signatories globally. So I think, you have that. And then secondly, something very interesting happened at the start of this year when Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, they control $6 trillion, so that's a lot of money by anybody's book, actually wrote in his annual letter that companies needed to articulate their purpose and demonstrate their societal impact in a much purer way. And so I think if you have organizations like BlackRock coming at this, saying, we're going to hold you guys to account, if you have the accounting firms, great. I think the sort of missing link, and I hear this quite a lot from corporates that we invest in, is, when will investors really value this stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm pretty certain if you spoke to most CFOs, they would say, we spend a lot of money trying to get this right. Does anybody actually care? I think they do, but I think when you look forward, say 20, 30 years, I think the thing that gives me hope that this will become absolutely the norm is the next generation. When you speak to millennials, particularly, people I meet and speak to when we're interviewing them to come to work, yes, of course, they want to earn a fair wage for fair work done. But I can honestly promise you, in the last 6 months, the longest conversation I've had with people I want to interview and want to bring into the firm is about values. Do they feel that their personal values will be compromised or enhanced, and hopefully enhanced, in joining us in the group effort? And I think that's just going to be more of the norm.
When I talk to a lot of students, just to echo that point, the one thing that comes through to me is they say, yes, I'd like to have a job that pays rather well, but I want to be able to go home, to talk to my parents, to go and meet my friends, and say I'm proud of what I do. Yeah. Which is an interesting sea change. But, well, let me take another headline that really struck me in the past couple of weeks. New York Times did a little survey. The survey was of Fortune 500 companies in the United States, and it found that there are more CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in the United States called James than women. Now,
I'm going to call, if I have a daughter, I'll call her James.
James. I happen to have a son called James. He's going to be fine. He's going to be, but I mean, that is really quite shocking, isn't it?
Yes. I think, obviously, that we still have a long way to go. But the last year has been quite remarkable. There was recently, I should go before last year, the BBC, the controversy around Martina Navratilovan's pay versus John McEnroe. So as in the pay gap, the Me Too movement, of course, there are a very low number of Fortune 500 CEOs. I recently watched this program about the Mercury, I think they called the Mercury 13. And they were 13 women in the 1960s who went through an entire program for NASA to be astronauts. And because they were women, they were never sent to space. We stand on their shoulders, and I guess that people like Catherine and others, the minister that was here this morning, have a role in mentoring and inspiring young girls to go into the corporate world.
Because that goes back to will the kind of culture around big business and investment change in the future? We've had Christine Lagarde, a woman in a very important position, IMF, talking about inclusive capitalism. Now, I'm not quite sure what she means, but it means, I think, that her analysis is things are not right at the moment. We're not getting the best people necessarily at the top. Is that fair?
I think that probably is fair. What I understand to be inclusive capitalism isn't so much gender-focused. It is really about having a fully inclusive perspective on a problem. And I think that actually we've come a long way in the past 10, 20 years. So the current stats would stand at about 33% of FTSE 350 companies would have female representation on the board. It's slightly less when you look at the executive teams. But I can tell you, as one of a small handful of women who was appointed to lead a FTSE 100 company a few years ago, it's a pretty lonely role. Yeah. I can honestly tell you that I think the role that the media play in both sort of creating the space and creating the barriers is incredibly important. And I think probably what I worry about, which perhaps is to Christine Lagarde's point, I worry a lot that good people won't choose positions of leadership because sometimes it's not all it's cracked up to be. Yeah, you know, if you put yourself or you find yourself on a pedestal, sometimes, you know, you're sort of fair pickings. And so I do worry that, you know, we need to create the right sort of environment so that it is worth it, because I think you truly need a diverse pool of people to lead all sorts of organizations to get the best out of them.
So if you were advising the people in this room and the people who may be watching, what would you say are likely then to be the biggest changes over the next 10, 20 years that will affect the financial and investment communities?
Well, certainly from my part would be technology, regulation, a combination of both. Certainly in fintech, we've seen the PSD2 that went into effect, was it earlier this year or last year? That would have a dramatic effect as it's breaking sort of the monopoly of banks around data and access to data, so will allow third parties to compete with banks in terms of financial services. So that's very exciting, because when there is competition, ultimately it trickles down to consumers and, you know, benefits consumers, makes consumers happier. It's something that is very adequate to the UAE. They have a ministry of happiness to ultimately to their citizens or their residents. So I think it's a combination of both regulation and technology. We've seen blockchain is one, artificial intelligence. We heard about quantum computing, machine learning. I mean, it's overwhelming.
And just bringing Catherine on the same point, but in terms of regulation, I mean, we have seen regulations come and go in the 90s. We know what happened in America then, and we know what the reaction in 2008, 2009, and so on. We're relearning the lessons of the 1930s. Where do you think we are on that? Because, you know, there are, on the one hand, there's continuing demands for less regulation. On the other hand, there is public demands for more accountability, people paying, international corporations paying taxes which are seen to be, quote, fair, unquote, rather than that which is necessarily legal, their legal obligations. So, I mean, how do you see that? Do you think those that demand for regulation will continue?
Well, probably. I mean, Dodd-Frank came after, 10 years ago after the financial meltdown. That was to strengthen, to, avoid excesses. Then we had Basel III, which will be essentially going into effect probably next year, because it was supposed to go into effect now. That has the virtue of strengthening capital requirements. So we're reducing leverage, we are increasing liquidity. So in effect, any bank that would, get hit by the tsunami would be able to take that stress test and not take the entire industry with it. So I think that, there is PSD2, there's GDPR. It's a good thing for consumers, but obviously the corporate world will think of it differently.
Catherine,
I was actually just going to make exactly the point that Lubna made, which is that let's not forget that the point about regulation is to protect consumers. I mean, it's very easy to forget that, during the financial crisis, people lost their life savings in many cases. So I think, that was the general point. I do sometimes wonder if the pendulum has swung too much in the other direction. So I think, for me, it's a question of trying to find the right balance. And I think it's interesting because certainly in the UK, and speaking to regulators, they're really wrestling with the whole field of not only fintech, but regtech. The extent to which certain roles, whether it's know your client or anti-money laundering or basic data analytics, will lead to people being out of work. I think the complexity of our organizations will change. I personally am a huge fan of doing a few things really well within your organization and then working out who you want to partner smartly with to get the rest done. So I think this idea is sort of universal full service models will probably shift And I think the other sort of bigger theme that's going to happen in our world over, probably the next 5 to 10 years is a blurring of the lines. Yeah. So, where things were very segmented before, I think there's going to be this blurring of the landscape. And frankly, I think it's going to be quite tough being a regulator in that environment because, where do you find the path which will both protect consumers but allow innovation at the same time?
That's the trick.
Tough to be a regulator, but also, as we know, governments, for good reasons, take a long time to take decisions. The kind of changes that you're talking about are happening now, and they haven't even caught up with those.
Correct.
Is that fair?
It's a fair statement, I would say.
So then the problem for the regulators is going to get even more complicated as businesses adopt cutting-edge technologies and governments slowly trying to figure out what to do about it.
Well, I think it is this point about balance. I mean, it's interesting because, the whole sort of field of fintech and the implications upon the banking sector is something that the Bank of England are now specifically building into their stress test scenarios. So it's happening today, but, it's slightly like garbage in, garbage out. So you've got to work out, what you're putting into the hopper.
Generally, I will always see the glass half full. I have high hopes for blockchain technology in this instance, not only in higher education, which is where we are fully invested, but also in healthcare and beyond. And I do believe that infusing accountability, visibility, immutability into financial systems in this instance is going to ultimately trickle down to the end consumer and benefit the end consumer. It will benefit government, taxpayer also. So personally, I have high hopes for in terms of technology.
Catherine,
and where it's going.
Please don't spoil it.
No, I'm not going to pop your bubble because that would be a sad thing to do. No, I think actually the future of money and investment is really bright for those who want to embrace it. And I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier that I think all organizations have an element of inertia embedded in them. And, people will either change and adapt, or I think, they're just going to become like the dinosaurs, they're going to become extinct. So I think for those who are ambitious, forward-thinking, innovative, and want to grab the change, I think there are so many opportunities open to us. But I think what it will force is that for those people who think, well, if I just stick my head in the sand and ignore it, it will all go away, I think they're going to be the dinosaurs of the future.
Yes.
On that happy note of agreement and moderate optimism, thank you very much. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Come on up, panel as well. So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session on the future of news. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel here, so I'm not going to delay you from hearing from them. We've been talking a lot about disruption today, and when I was at school, disruption was the kind of thing that got you a detention. I was at a school in California last week where disruption was literally on the syllabus. And so we're going to be thinking now about what happens to this industry as it gets disrupted. Take you back, 1439, city of Strasbourg. Imagine the town crier. He's happily ringing his bell, telling everyone the latest news, without realizing that just around the corner there is a German goldsmith who's about to invent the printing press. And within the lifetime of his kids, there will be 20 million books and publications in Europe. With that idea in mind, as we think about disruption, we know that there will be Kodaks, the industries, the ideas that can't keep up. And we know that there will be Airbnbs, the fantastic new ideas that we haven't yet realized that we can't live without. And so I want to start actually with Christian and with Mina, what's your sense of where the Kodaks are and where the Airbnbs are for the news business?
Well, if the Kodak story tells us anything, it's that it's unpredictable. I don't think many people saw Kodak coming, and that sometimes it's the biggest companies that fail. When digital disruption comes along, it's not about how successful you are before the disruption, it's about how well you cope with change. We closed our print edition a couple of years ago now. We're fully online, and the business is flying, and the journalism is now more read and more influential than ever, so we're very happy with that.
So the Independent is the Airbnb?
Yeah, of course I'm going to say that. I'm not going to say it's a Kodak, am I? But no, it's a sincere belief too.
But is there an idea out there or a way of doing business that will become the Kodak of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was going to pull you up on gently is to hail Airbnb as the ultimate goal. I mean, Airbnb has not stood the test of time. Airbnb is great. I'm a massive fan of Airbnb, and I'm not saying it won't stand the test of time. But we have to also aspire for longevity because that's what's made this industry great. So it's not always about being the latest platform. I think that actually over the next few years, what I hope to see is a great maturing of the digital news horizon and the industry into something that really reconnects with its values and what made this industry great in the first place, rather than jumping to a trend or I'm going to call it tool rather than toy, but you know what I mean.
So, Minnie, you can pick a different example if you like than Airbnb. Apologies, there may be a better one out there. But what's your sense of who are the disruptors and what gets disrupted?
Well, I guess, the next Airbnb, if we're talking about media, is that outlet that can personalize, that can engage with each one of you directly and know what will catch your attention and what will keep you engaged. And what platform, what outlet is almost irrelevant. So when we think about it at the National, we think of ourselves as having 5 outlets. We've got the print edition, we've got our website, we've got our app, we've got our social media streams that are now almost like their own outlet. And then we've got our specially packaged products, so podcasts for those who want to listen to them, videos for those who want videos. So the idea is to personalize, but also, as much as possible, give variety. But I think at the heart of it is, yes, Kodak went bust, although they are reviving now, interestingly. The idea is people still want photos, right? So it's the concept. People will still want reliable, smart news. They want to be engaged. So once you figure that out, I think it's just learning very quickly, as we're hearing about technologies changing, learning very quickly how to keep that reader engagement.
But to do that, Raji, you have to pay for it.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, I think I come from the US. Most local newspapers in the US are going to go out of business. There are about 1,200 of them. I think there'll be 600 in a couple of years' time. So I think they'll be the Kodaks. I think television industry, as we currently think of it, is going to go the way of Kodak as well. They still have 40% of all advertising dollars spent go to TV. That money is going to go away pretty quickly. So unless they change, I think that's going to be an industry in trouble. I also have a business model answer to this. Those media companies that think advertising and subscriptions are the only ways to make money are going to be in a lot of trouble. I think most media companies can have like 7 to 9 different revenue streams, and unless you explore all of them and kind of have multiple revenue streams, you'll be in a lot of trouble.
Do you agree, Tom?
Yes, I think it's worth going back to the beginnings of digital news when we all rushed to put our content for nothing on the internet. Really stupid. Toothpaste makers don't give away toothpaste, but we gave it away on the hope of some vague dream in the future somehow money would come, and it was centered around advertising. I think it's becoming clear now with the vast inventory, the vast opportunities to advertise elsewhere, news websites are not particularly essential. So that advertising model, I think, is not going to work for most players. What I think is becoming clear is that people are willing to pay for facts, something to get them, the trusted news, to get through this fog of the internet, fake news, etc. So I think subscriptions are going to play a really key role in providing the basic revenue for the brands, and then looking at brand extensions, so using strong newspaper and digital brands to do conferences, to do things like that, make money at the side, to do that. I think the big challenge for legacy companies is how do you go from print to digital? You need to sustain print in the short term, provide the foundations for investment in digital, and how do you change the culture, and how do you move that to digital as print declines, perhaps 10% circulation per year? And that's what a lot of people are beginning to work out, how you can do that, and how you get value from subscriptions.
So the future is rosy then. We have great ideas for how to translate the industry into the digital era. There's a way of paying for it. But then we run into the blizzard of attacks that we're now seeing, even from our political leaders against independent media. You could say now that 3 of the 5 permanent Security Council members are led by leaders who have been very critical of the fake news media, the mainstream media. How do we survive that? How do we survive that, Christian?
Always beware politicians who take pot shots at the media. It's never. It's usually for reasons that aren't always wholesome. Fake news is a phrase that's justified in some circumstances, but mainly abused by people that want to shut down debate and want to shut down a free press. And for a while, it's been growing. It's been amplified because those who use the phrase often have something to gain by using the phrase, such as very traditional media outlets who like to use it to delegitimize the threat, and as politicians who want to remove the criticism. The way to defeat it is through great journalism and through rebuilding trust. I think that our news industry suffers partly because it always loves a negative headline, and we also like a negative headline about ourselves, which means that we're often very critical of each other. I wish we were to celebrate what we do a little more, and I certainly think we need to, as Mina was saying, reconnecting with audiences who want to form the kind of relationship that we saw develop in the print era. People who would subscribe to a newspaper because their parents subscribed to a newspaper means that they really buy into that brand. And if you're that much invested in that brand, you're going to believe their news. So how can you tell if a headline that you see out there on Twitter is fake? Well, you're probably going to look at the masthead of the publisher that's sending it to you. And there will be companies you trust, and there will be companies you don't trust. And I think as digital matures, and yes, the plurality of things we offer is a big part of it. Subscription's a big part of it because you're entering a real bond of trust with readers there. But owning that relationship in a much more wholesome way rather than relying on secondary platforms such as social media.
Can the industry weather the storm?
I just think that it does illustrate the retreat into trusted brands. So BuzzFeed, for example, is laying off people, and that was held out as the big hope. That was the solution, pure digital, etc. But as fake news comes in, people become more uncertain what's true, what's not true. They retreat to brands that they know and trust. I think that's a big hope for the legacy media industry, so-called legacy media industry, if we can exploit that.
The only way we're going to be able to combat fake media in terms of that term is by showing that trusted brands and trusted news outlets are accurate and do their own fact-checking and put their hands up when they have to correct things. But also on the flip side, and we really suffer from this in this part of the world, is that people are trusting increasingly what's shared with them by their friends. And so what happens is, you know, in some ways we're all publishers, right? So I will put something on Facebook, or I'll send a WhatsApp message to Raju saying this has happened, and he trusts it because he hopefully trusts me. The problem that's happening is that people are resharing posts that they have no idea where they've come from. So with photoshopping, you know, with voiceovers, with all sorts of things, that's being seen as news. And it's not. You know, just a random post is not news. So I think also as journalists, and to go forward, we have to also redefine what is news and what we own and what we're responsible for. But then there's all this other noise that actually is not news. It's posts or whatever they are. And I think that element of distinguishing between what's fake, and that's not the same element as fake news, but also media literacy for younger people, but also older people. You know, you have people now who believe things because they come to them because they're from a generation that believes anything that's published has to be verified one way or the other, and of course it's not.
In most of the trust conversation, and fake news conversation has focused on journalism as it should. But I think our industry is also to blame for the declining trust on two other areas. Clearly, the media literacy issue is important to regain trust, and I think we've walked away from that in our schools. But the other couple of areas are the lack of diversity in newsrooms, the lack of women in leadership, the lack of racial and other diversity. We can't expect to accurately reflect the audiences we are trying to reach when our newsrooms are usually white and male. Right? So I think there's a problem in our industry that we need to really address to regain trust in a more meaningful way. The second issue is, as an industry, we have grown up on what I call the tummy compass, which is your gut feel. And we are having to deal with competition like Facebook and everybody else, where the decisions are based on data, and data is coming from their audiences. And while we all pay lip service to our audiences, most newsrooms are still very kind of a gut feel driven decision-making process. So we have to also evolve and kind of understand why we are losing trust. It's not just Donald Trump telling us that we are fake news. There's actually some fundamental reasons.
And assuming the industry can have that conversation with itself, can make those changes, can start to regain the trust, it can maybe survive the disruption of the internet. But can it then survive the disruption that will come from artificial intelligence?
I think artificial intelligence is an extremely good tool for news gathering, to use it intelligently, to help, etc. So, for example, robotic reporting, where I used to work, Reuters uses that a lot. So for market reports, pro forma, stuff like that, you can use it to generate stories, which then frees up journalists to do investigative reporting and analysis. So I think interpretation and analysis is going to become very important. So within limited parameters, I think AI and robotic reporting is going to become very important, but it won't remove the human element of that added value.
Yeah, I think you have to be very cautious about the limits about the remit of anything that's automated in the newsroom. Fundamentally,
stories that need just the scores of the latest football match. You don't really need one of us to be writing it. But for someone to tell you blow by blow what that last game was really about and what your star player...
Extract that data and provide a story in nanoseconds. A human cannot do it. So a computer is extremely good at that. And that's what moves markets, which in the real-time news market is critically important. Then journalists can do the analysis of it. But that instant alert, the instant reaction in the market, and then the analysis, it's a very useful tool.
And I'm curious as to whether you're seeing that transformation actually speeding up. I mean, that conversation that you have effectively with the AI over whether to write a story, how to write it, and how to sell it, and where to sell it. Mm. Is that changing before our eyes?
It's becoming a lot more normal, I think. These things have had a certain sense of novelty value about them a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago. Now, I think most members of the young generation of journalists who are coming through, it's very reassuring, actually. It's like being fluent in a language. At first, if you're learning a new language, all you can think about is the language. And then once you're fluent in it, you just speak. And it's about the message. And it's the same kind of thing with these data tools or AI tools. At first, they're very shiny and new and strange. And so you fixate on how is it working? What's it telling me? And then when it becomes a little bit of a normal protocol in your day, that's when you see some more wholesome benefits coming through.
And does that have an impact on the business model as well? Are there moments when you would deliberately prioritize a story that you know will play well on social media and be noticed by wherever the sources of money are for the news, over a more worthy, less exciting, less marketable story? Mina?
You have to consider what is going to be appealing to your audience. And the problem now is your audience is segmented because you have your core readers who will come to you, will come to the platform's actual homepage and see what you've chosen for them, what you think is the priority is number one. But then you have those who are either coming through search or through social, and those you have to be much more strategic about. What time you're posting something, user behavior. So for example, we think about that in a newsroom all the time, is that there are certain either comment pieces or entertainment stories that people will want to be reading as they're winding down. First thing in the morning, you need your business stories, you need your news stories, what's going on. So that you think more strategically with. But we're still investing a lot of money and a lot of resources into the stories we think need to be told. And then we put in the extra effort to make sure that we're broadening their reach.
I mean, there's a tendency to blame data and analytics for some of the behaviors in chasing certain stories or pandering or going after eyeballs. The reality is that the culture of a newsroom is set by the people who run the newsroom. So either you are data-driven, then you chase all these things, or you're data-informed, where the data is telling you what is working and what's not. I mean, this morning's front page stories here were all about the election results in Lebanon. Chances are that a lot of people may not necessarily be interested in that topic, especially online. So the challenge is, how do you make an important story like that, which you still need to write about, more relevant to people, and what are the hooks that you give? You just don't say that nobody's going to read this and not have it on your homepage, right? So I think the difference is really behavioral and whether you're data-informed or data-driven.
And while it's appealing to use data to that extent, it's useful as an aid. But I think you've got to retain the brand values. You've got to be true to your brand values and making a mix of what's going to be really read and what is useful potentially to your audience, but it may not be a major traffic driver, which again comes back to the brand, which is what you're trying to build trust in.
And there must be a responsibility on us, the readers, the consumers, as well, to approach this content in as efficiently curious, critical way. Which means that we don't just say, oh, please have lots of worthy stories, but we'd rather read the clickbait. So I hope that as we educate people to be more sophisticated, really, in how they approach news, as one of the reactions to fake news, we'll become more discerning ourselves.
Yep.
Yeah, and a challenge, I mean, I see more of a challenge to the journalists. I mean, I completely agree with what you were just saying there, is that when we began what was quite a rapid period of transformation from a print title to a digi pure play, we still had an essential tool to building all the kinds of reader loyalty and engagement that we're talking about. It's how the challenge back to journalists is to engage the readers in the stuff that counts.
Your mention of really tough questions reminds me that we're about to open this up to some really tough questions. There are 2 microphones around, so do start to warm up your question. Just to give you time to find a microphone and to put your hand up. Just one last thought from me for the one last question for the panel. There may be here and watching later people going into journalism, 19, 20 years old, with a career ahead of them. What's your advice to them about the sorts of skills and mindset they will need, not just to survive the digital century, but to thrive in it?
I think they need the basic skills, multimedia skills, but above all, they need curiosity. They've got to be sure in 30 years' time they'll still be curious and probing and asking questions. And can I just mention the British Council, because I represent the British Council as well. We have a scheme where we take 100 of the brightest undergraduates and postgraduates in the world of any discipline who want to be journalists, and we take them to Scotland, and they meet the leaders of the international media industry, and we hope we're seeding a new generation of media leaders with the qualities for good journalism that will sustain them for the next 20, 30 years. But above all, I think it's curiosity.
Curiosity.
It's funny, that was the word that was in my mind. I was going to say curiosity. But I'll add 2 more to that. So one's curiosity. 2 is journalistic skills. Regardless of what we're talking about and the platforms we're using, or the cycles, the news cycle is changing all the time. But in reality, it's journalistic skills of how you research, how you do a good interview. If you're 19, 20-year-old thinking to go into journalism, hone those skills, because that's what you need to do. But also be aware that today you compete with the whole world. So if you're coming out from Abu Dhabi, you're still competing with somebody who's perhaps working on a story coming out from Australia. And so that competition is, you have to be aware of the media landscape all the time, because it's changing and you're always going to have to be ahead of the curve. Not just as a publisher or as a leader of an institution, but even as a journalist, you have to be aware of that. You can't be comfortably working on a story that's only 600 words over 3 days and hope somehow throw it out there and it's going to get picked up.
Yeah, I mean, today's digital audience wants to not just read a story, but they want to see pictures, they want to watch video, they want to listen to podcasts. So your ability to engage them on multiple platforms and some of the skills that it requires, I think, is key. It doesn't mean you need to know how to do coding, or you need to be able to write, interactive graphics. Most of us got into journalism because we were terrible at math to begin with, right? So to ask us to change that is going to be hard. But to be able to have that conversation with a developer or programmer in your newsroom to say, how do I take my words and my pictures and my video, and how do we make it more engaging? So the changing the prism from just kind of communicating to engaging, I think, is a good way to think about it. And I would, if somebody is young and thinking of journalism, I would say it'll be great if you know multiple languages. Yeah. It's a real skill.
Christian, what do you say to the new arrivals at the Independent?
I usually say three things. First is have fun. It's an amazing industry to be involved in. Every single day is a new challenge. There are new formats coming out the whole time. It will continue to stretch you and challenge you and offer you wonderful opportunities like no other industry. Second thing related is keep learning. Just because you've graduated with a specific skill set today doesn't mean you're going to be in any way prepared for what journalism might look like in 20 years' time, but you'll be there if you keep learning. And the third thing, which is the most important one, is remember today why you're getting into the industry. Those values that you bring with you when you decide to be a journalist are crucial and unchanging. And when other tech platforms rush towards news, when you get Google and Apple and Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and everybody wanting a piece of news, they really want those values because readers always want those values.
Great. I'm going to throw it open now then. Do we have the mics? Can we have the hands? There's one over here and there's one over here. And I can see a pink sleeve. Should we start? Just there, please.
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for for everything you guys said in the panel. I'm currently a senior here at NYU Abu Dhabi. My question is, in a generation where everyone is following influencers or figureheads who are distributing news, how do media outlets keep up with the pace of influencers?
In a world where there are often more social media influencers than the rest of us to actually be influenced, how do you compete?
I mean, journalism has always had people who were larger than life, right? I mean, the Washington Post had Bob Woodward and Bernstein. The difference was that they used to always work for a media platform or a media brand. Now, a lot of these journalists can reach audiences directly and are their own brands. So we have to kind of live with that fact. I won't go out there and try to compete against individuals trying to do interesting things, but like if you look at the National, it's got some amazing columnists, and their pictures are always being kind of presented because people relate to people. So I think we're doing a pretty good job actually keeping up with the rise of individual influencers.
So I think also what you mean by influencers, because you're absolutely right. We have columnists, we have sometimes our journalists go out and cover a great story, and we let them use the first person, because most journalists actually hate using the first person. The story shouldn't be them, it's the story they're covering. But every now and then we allow them to do that so that people relate to them. But it's important to say that there is that difference also from social media influencers, because often they are more often than not in the center of the story, and you're going directly to them as an individual rather than the platform. And so it's different skills, and I think also how they perceive themselves differently. Most journalists actually don't want to be in the middle of it, but they do it to further their stories as much as they can.
And I suppose it goes back to trust, that columnists and those who interpret for trusted brands probably have more credibility. You can trust them perhaps more than an unknown person on social media, though they have a role as well. So again, it comes back to that building the brand, integrity, getting it right, having opinions, etc.
I think work with them. If you don't know who they are and they're big influencers, get to know them, reach out. They usually get a fantastic response because publishers are big social media influencers too, and it's much better to work with. Because I think there's something slightly dangerous about citizen journalism if it's kept separate from the established media. No one would be excited about the phrase citizen surgery or citizen banking or something. You wouldn't trust that, and you would say, no, stop, stop. But when we work with people and you bring them into what you do, we have a very open comment platform called Voices, but we make sure that everything adheres to certain criteria. You know, we apply standards, and we work with influencers and bloggers to, you know, they find it interesting to work with us because they learn a little, and then everyone benefits.
Another question, just at the back here.
This is Hussein Karaguli from Deutsche Bank. Thank you, fascinating. The RAND Corporation put out a study just recently called Truth Decay. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but some of the findings, just quote a couple of things, which I'd like to get your sort of thoughts on. There's a heightened disagreement about facts and analytical interpretations of data, the blurred line between opinion and fact, and a diminished trust in formerly respected institutions as sources of factual information. So I know you addressed some of them, but I'm curious to what you think solutions are. Thank you.
The blurring of fact and opinion.
Well, The Independent has often championed its opinion, and we do seek to go beyond the basic facts to tell a story, and we need to today. There have never been so many spin doctors, PRs, and people who want to put facts out there, and they all do it to tell their own story. Everyone's telling a story these days. We're way beyond the era where politicians stood up in their Houses of Parliament or equivalent and said what they were genuinely going to do next. So we have to question and we have to get beyond them. We have to get beyond those initial facts and quotations. But we have to also make sure that we're doing it to get to the truth and not to get to an agenda. The other question is the kind of fast news versus the kind of analytical stuff. Truth is we have to get better at both. I think that in the print media, because of that time delay, you're always trying to pitch ahead for the next morning. That part of the industry has always been very strong on the deep analysis, and that's great. I think that there's a lot to evolve around live coverage. I think live blogs are a start, but then there's live streaming. We actually have a separate, one of our senior execs actually takes care of the live side of what we do. And another of our senior execs kind of is more the guy that kind of casts forward to tomorrow. But on the live side, Chloe, who works with us, has been very effective. She comes from a broadcast background. So I think some of the lessons for newspapers is to learn from broadcast on live stuff.
Do you feel that sense of the news speeding up, that there's more news out there than before?
Absolutely. When you have a political speech made, everyone looks at Twitter, and Twitter's immediate, and politicians engage on Twitter. So it's not, some people kind of deride that and think that that's kind of overly simplistic, but when you have the President of the United States issuing pretty important statements on Twitter, you have to take these platforms seriously. It doesn't just mean that you repeat anything that you see on Twitter, but it's certainly a valid platform to look at when you're covering live news.
Tom?
There is the other side of the coin. I mean, the Times of London is now publishing 3 digital editions during the day. So they're taking the view that considered curated news at fixed times may have more value, and their subscriptions have been going up. So I think that's another way to do it. Another way is, and what I've been doing recently, is looking at how news agencies, which have been doing live news for 100 years, how that can be migrated into traditional newsrooms, and how you use the techniques that have been perfected over these hundreds of years can then be put back into the newsroom. So it's maybe not all just breaking news. It may be curated news has more value for certain brands.
Yeah.
One of the positive developments of the last year and a half in all this fake news has been the amount of resources, energy that has gone into fact-checking. Right? Used to be that, a couple of places that used to do fact-checking would do 2 days later, they would publish a story saying, we checked the facts and it was not right. Now it's fairly instantaneous. So in that sense, I think there's been some positive developments. The other thing is we tend to associate a lot of negativity with speed. I would argue that one of the benefits of social media and one of the benefits of speed has been our ability to correct mistakes has become a lot faster and a lot more real time. I mean, in the good old days, if a newspaper on a front page made a mistake, they would correct it 3 days later in a small little thing on page 3 that very few people would read. Now, there's a fairly instantaneous corrections that also, sure, they don't maybe spread as much as the original story did, but our ability to inform people about mistakes is also kind of significantly improved, which is a healthy thing.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to take it in a slightly different direction because there's the issue now that everything's about perspective. And there's this blurring of actually there are facts and there are facts on the ground. And that's becoming much more difficult because it's great to have opinion, and we also find that people love opinionated pieces. And you know, the more compelling headline is, or the more moving a video is, the more it gets read and shared. And again, being data informed or data driven, quite often you're trying to put pieces together that gets people emotionally charged in one way or the other, so either happy or angry or whatever. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we still have to have the facts and the facts right and set. And that's about the truth decay. I mean, the fact that people now say, well, it depends, that's your opinion, when it's actually informed, absolutely double sourced, triple sourced, but then it starts being perceived as just perspective rather than fact.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got time, I think, for at least one.
You've got one.
In the front row here, sir.
Uh-oh.
I would like to ask you guys about how the speed and social media has changed your ability not to communicate about a topic, having external factors influencing. Let's take a fiction case of a famous newspaper in the United States not liking a candidate for the US election and not having the ability not to communicate about that. I would say that instead of a two-page spread full of quotes that are insulting to people just to remind how bad the language was, how come no one dares, the day of the election of the US president, if you have an editorial line that opposes that candidate, not to put the candidate on front page?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons, and it's not yet fully learned, is this notion of like both strategic silence, when you don't need to jump on every story and chase every dog whistle that comes from his tweets. I think that we haven't learned in a meaningful way. And two, I think part of our challenge, especially in the US, has been this very traditional notion that the news pages are going to be very, for the lack of a better word, objective. And that has caused certain interesting kind of problems in communicating what you really want to say. And I think I don't think we have solved for that yet, but it's a real issue.
Yeah, I think there's always a danger of, it almost sounds a bit like no platforming or something if you kind of boycott covering someone in a paper or on a website. There are some stories that you just don't want to give the oxygen of publicity to, but I think if it's someone who's been elected into office, I think there's an obligation to cover those stories. I think that it doesn't mean that you have to suddenly fall in line with a candidate that becomes a president, for instance, because they've suddenly got power. But certainly I think you have to continue to hold them to account all the more if you don't agree with them.
You can report about it, but put it on page 2 and page something else on page 1, which would have two benefits. The first one is you're making a very powerful statement. Second, your edition becomes collector, and people are going to talk about it a lot more than you being another newspaper putting the president on page 1. So it will be good for sale, it will be good for reputation, you will have free publicity, and you'll make a powerful statement. So far, no one has done that, and that's actually surprising for someone who's not a journalist.
But I think you can only do that a few times. I mean, the reality is there are sometimes stories. So, for example, journalists get a lot of rap, or newspaper editors get a lot of rap that you're always focusing on negative news. You know, if there's explosion somewhere, you put it on the front page, and then somebody may have, you know, gotten a patent in a really important technological find, and yet you'll bury that on page 6. The problem is sometimes, and quite often, the events are too big for you to say, actually, I'd like for this not to be the front page, because it is our job also to make sure that our readers especially our subscribers and our loyal base, know that we're going to give them what is the most compelling story of that day and what is the most impactful story of that day. And so it's a really tough decision because there are times when we're like, actually want to step the story that everybody else is talking about, especially, again, when you have a terrible event like an explosion or otherwise. Everybody's seen it on TV. They've seen it on their social media feeds. So why are we putting it on the front page? Well, we're putting it on the front page because of the magnitude of it, but also because that's what's going to drive certain political decisions and all the fallout that comes from it.
And Olivier, just to, I think you can swing the other way too. If those of you remember when President Trump started his campaign, Huffington Post said, we are not going to cover him in politics, we're going to cover him in entertainment. Right? And that lasted for about a month, right, before they discovered that actually he's a serious politician, whether we like it or not. But I think your point, I think television, which continues to cover his events without interruption for an hour, let him say whatever he wants to say, I think there is a genuine problem, but it's also driven by their desire for ratings. So we are not entirely at, it's not journalism that is driving some of that too.
Just very quick then from Tom.
Just the one tangential angle to this, which is striving for balance. So we try for balance, but you have to be very careful to get equally credible sources. So Brexit is a good example. Many people feel that the Brexiteers were given undue prominence, but had lacked credibility. But it was the desire by certain broadcasters and others to get absolute balance, which may have distorted the truth.
We are running right out of time now, but I just want to get 10 seconds very quickly, Mina, on the UAE in the midst of all this transformation. What's the specific niche for the UAE?
The media niche here is that actually for a country that is in the middle of the Middle East, the interests here, the people that come through here are global. So I think one of the things that stands out in this country is that we can talk about global trends. They're quite often being either shaped here or being shaped by people who have connections here. And that gives us an opportunity. When we're talking about the future, this is definitely a country of the future. And so we have an edge in covering that.
I apologize we didn't get to more of the many questions out there, but I'm promising on behalf of the panel that they will answer any questions you have over Twitter. You can find all their handles on the Future Forum hashtag and on the Future Forum Twitter handle. Do fire them any questions you like. No one is storming off in disgust at the idea. Thank you for a fantastic conversation, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Right.
You're staying up here, right?
Right. Well, that was the last session. So I get the duty of closing today's forum. I really want to keep us on time, so we're already 2 minutes ahead of time, so this is going to be very brief. I've decided to leave behind my remarks and just speak directly to you. First of all, thank you all, those of you attending, those of you tuning in, those of you tweeting, but most importantly, those of you who shared the stage here and spoke to us. This is our inaugural event for an initiative that's going to be a 12-month-long initiative for the National. I'm waiting for a clicker, that's why I'm stalling, I apologize. Thank you. Okay. So, we have 4 announcements. One I already previewed in my opening remarks. First, we will be hiring a future editor at the National. So all these ideas you have, all the questions you have, we will try to address over the next 12 months, and a future editor who we are currently recruiting for, so send me your CVs, will be taking that on. It's a regional first. Secondly, we are going to have future deep dives. These are going to be particular subject areas that we want to take on in more detail. We are going to work with certain industry leaders, and we are going to roll them out over the next 12 months. They will be in various formats, whether it's in articles, videos, podcasts, and working with our excellent team here in Abu Dhabi, our bureau in London, and our reporters around the world. Thirdly, I'm really proud to announce the Future of Journalism competition. And this we are pegging to 16 to 21-year-olds all over the world who want to come in and tell us what they think the future of journalism is going to be like. We're going to announce details shortly on our website, thenational.ae. But what we want to do is engage our current and future readers to tell us where they see the future of journalism. And then finally, the National Fellows. I spoke briefly about this in the morning. We're very proud that the Emirates Youth Council has worked with us and identified for us 6 fellows who will be working with us to think about all the issues of importance for the UAE, for the region and the world when it comes to the future. They will work with us both in informing some of our editorial drive and the previous 2 initiatives that I announced, but also will be an opportunity for us to open our doors more widely and make sure that we're learning also from our readers and our audiences. With that, I want to again thank you for being here. I want to thank Ittihad, who were our official carrier and brought in our wonderful speakers, and stay tuned, much more to come. Thank you.
night chills, night chills, night chills, night chills.